Good afternoon, and welcome to session 6, the final session of the Linking Administrative Data with Survey Data virtual data training. I am your host, Amber Amin Ra, and the data project manager here at ICPSR on the campus of the University of Michigan. I'd like to introduce Rupa Datta, who will discuss budgeting, evaluating different opportunities, and research designs, possible linkage ideas.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We are in the home stretch, right? This is our last session. And so in thinking about what we should talk about today, we, of course, will go through the two topics that we had identified, the budgeting and sort of general project planning, as well as the trade-offs and evaluating different possible designs. But in addition, there was one topic that we've talked about frequently throughout the sessions, but I felt that it might be important to reemphasize a bit, that maybe it was getting a little short shrift. And so I just want to reiterate that there are some sampling implications of linkages that we aren't always cognizant of, and that can mean a great deal to your analysis. So I've inserted a little extra topic there. Yesterday, as you'll recall, we talked about the quality of the linkages, including, how to anticipate challenges to the linkages, how to think about linkage errors, both missed matches as well as false linkages, and then other quality considerations of the linkage, and then disclosure protections and how the requirements for disclosure may need to be incorporated early on in your research design and analytics planning. We had a request for some resources on linking, and a list is in the works that we should be able to share with you in a minute. Today, as I mentioned, there are really three things I wanted to talk about. Planning for a linkage project, and I think that we can well characterize most linkage projects as iterations, clarifications, and negotiations on many different fronts. Sampling implications of linkage choices, and then trade-offs when you're thinking about how you're going to approach research design. How do we think about it? What are some of the choices that we need to make? And hopefully that will send you well on your way to successful linkage. Okay, so here we are at project planning. How do you think about planning for your linkage project? And I should say that in what we've been talking about, obviously there's quite a range of types of linkage. Probably the most simple types of linkage are where we're using very limited geographic information in conjunction with public use data. So you're going to use, the public use NSEC household survey. The only restricted use thing you need is the state. And then you're going to link it to public information about policies. You're going to add in information about the extent of pre-K, public pre-K in a state. So it's a public use data set that you're restricting by geography and then linking in state level policy information. That's at the fairly safe, more readily feasible, less likely to throw you for a lot of loops end of these linkage projects. On the other end, we might be talking about an individual level linkage, perhaps with administrative data that an agency has never shared before with an external researcher for analytic purposes. And so there's no process, there's not really documentation, they don't even have a process for getting the contractor to pull the file, and that's sort of probably at the hardest end of what a linkage project could look like. So we are, a lot of what I'm going to be characterizing, it tries to capture kind of the full continuum of what you might expect, understanding that depending on what type of linkage project you're thinking about, it may be not quite as complex or may be at the high end of what I'm forecasting. So one thing to keep in mind is that this kind of work may involve actual expenditures. And the two most common types of expenditures would be that the data access itself involves a fee. So, for example, the Census Research Data Centers have a desk fee for access to the RDC. In some cases, the data provider may request reimbursement for the cost of data provision. So, as I mentioned, a lot of states have contractors who maintain their systems. And so to pull a data file, they actually need to ask the contractor to do that work. The contractor, of course, does not do it for free. So the state may ask the researcher to cover the cost of that contractor time to pull the data file. I think I gave the example yesterday that the NSEC team will create a custom variable for a researcher using confidential data to make it less confidential so that the researcher can access it. OPRE would not fund, the sponsoring agency would not generally cover the cost of that work. And so the project team might ask the researcher to cover the cost of that variable construction. In general, the costs are not usually very high. I would think that I've rarely seen a cost that was outside of the several $100 range, unless it was very involved somehow. But there might be a cost, and it can sometimes take a while to figure out how it's going to get paid, who's in the invoice whom, and how does the money get paid, and at the front end or the back end, and all that kind of stuff. The other type of cost that sometimes comes up is how the data will actually be accessed. In some cases, I work on the National Longitudinal Surveys of Youth. We have data that can only be accessed in the Bureau of Labor Statistics offices in Washington, D.C. So you have to go to Washington, camp out there for a couple weeks while you do your analysis. In other cases, you don't have to go anywhere, but you may have to have a designated computer that doesn't connect to the internet, or even a room that is, again, does not connect to the internet, that has a locked door that nobody can access, who doesn't have permission to see the data. And so there would be costs potentially associated with that kind of work. In terms of schedule, I would say the hardest part of the linkage project schedule to maneuver is the part before any of the work happens. And so getting permission to actually get your hands on the data is almost always the longest, slowest part of the process. I was sharing recently that I have a project where the Child Care Subsidy Agency approached me. They were going to pay NORC to do analyses of their subsidy file, which they own. They're very excited about the project. It's been 6 months, and they still have not been able to give me this data file. They have the data file. They want to give us the work. Our attorneys are willing. Their attorneys are willing, but we still have not been able to complete all of the steps of the data use process. And that is really not atypical at all if you're talking about individual level administrative data from an agency that is not in the business of sharing those data files. I've had other times when we've spent 15, 18 months with a willing agency interested in analysis, and have them give up at the end of it because they could not get the process to the authorization to share the data. Hopefully that's not your case, but in any event, it's almost certainly the case that the agreement will involve lawyers, your institution's lawyers, and possibly somebody else authorized to sign on behalf of the institution, which is often like a dean or in some cases, a department head. In general, the data provider's lawyers, whether it's a state agency or NORC or whoever it might be, will also need to weigh in and sign the document. You will generally be required to get institutional review board clearance of the process. And then, as I mentioned, there might be small costs. The costs, even if they're several $100s, can add several weeks, if not a couple of months, of just arrangement time as the agency figures out how they're going to charge you $500 and whom you write the check out to and things like that. So this early process can be quite involved, particularly when there are not precedents to follow about how the data access. During analysis, things are a little bit more routine, but I would say that you might expect the analytic process to take maybe 2 to 3 times as long as you would expect it to take with just survey data or maybe even just the administrative data. And so some of the issues are that on the administrative data side, especially if they are not frequently having external researchers work with the data, it may be quite challenging to get a clarification request about the data answered. And this is true both for state agencies or federal agencies, but also for commercial vendors of data. The way they think about their data is quite different from how researchers tend to think about data. And so the types of questions that we often ask, which are either about, well, why is there a -2 there? Or can you tell me if the same process generated the data in Connecticut as in Virginia? Those are often questions that they haven't really thought about. And so your request may bounce around in the organization for a while, and it may or may not get answered. As we talked about yesterday, that disclosure restrictions may require you to revisit the analytic plan. In addition, the data exploration stage, especially with data that haven't often been worked with, and even if each individual data source has been worked with, the linked data may not have been worked with, and so you might just find more surprises in your early exploration than you would in other data circumstances. And so the incidence of work, rework, that didn't work really well, let's try this again, what should we do now? How should we tweak the research plan? I think you can expect that that will happen, and you would want to allow time for that. And then often you will have services from the data provider on one side or another, whether it's that they will conduct the linkage for you, or they're going to create a variable for you, or pull a data file, or deal with documentation requests. There's almost always a clearance process at the end where they review the disclosure issues. All of those things can often take multiple iterations. So you submit something for permission to publish, and they say no. Could you do this or that? And then you have to negotiate until you get to something you can work with. And then finally, in the end stage, the disclosure review process can take weeks and may take work on your part. As I said, it could be iterative. You might be negotiating. They might require clarification on what you've actually done and whether that fulfills their disclosure requirements or not. Both your linkage data and your survey data may have restrictions. Sometimes they conflict, And so then you might need to get to a mutually negotiated agreement so that everyone is satisfied. And then all of this has to happen every time you revise something. So you submit a journal article, they send some reviewer comments, you need to redo one tabulation. That's going to take you 3 weeks because maybe you that afternoon rerun your regression. You still have to go through all of those same disclosure steps. You still have to give the data provider whatever number of weeks they get for review. You might still have to negotiate, all of those sorts of things. So that process can be slow, and I don't know that it's difficult to get the outcome you want. It just takes time. And then often the data set is not yours at the end. IRBs often require destruction of the linked data after a certain period of time. In the case of the restricted use data, the data provider may have only allowed you, for example, remote access through an enclave-like setting so that the data are not actually in your possession. Some journals would ask that you archive your data file. There may be ways to provide accessibility for the purpose of being able to reproduce findings, but it's not the same as when you have the data file sitting on your hard drive. And those are all just sort of different aspects. Who has something to share about other issues that they've encountered in terms of how they planned their project and unanticipated issues that they next time will know better? Or would you disagree with any of this? Do you have an example? I think you probably all have pretty interesting experiences yourselves about this process of undertaking permission and conducting linked analysis. The people, I think a few folks are here from school districts. So is there something that you could share in terms of how you think about sharing your data or providing access to researchers who might be interested in using the data that you have internally? Either everyone has had only delightful experience linking data, or everyone's too traumatized. Nothing in the chat, Katie?
Hi, Rupa. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I have a question. So we've undertaken this pretty major project at the state level in our agency to link across multiple sources of administrative data. And all of this linking has been conducted by somebody in our IT department who's kind of hasn't revealed to us a whole lot of about how he's conducted the linking. He's retiring soon. So my question is, this is one example, but in a case where you have the linkage done by a third party, for example, how do you account after the fact, once you've already received the linked data? Are there safeguards you can put in place sort of retroactively to kind of responsibly use this data when we really have less of an idea of how the linkage was conducted?
That's a great question. So I'll start not with the ex post scenario, but the preventive scenario, which is that I really encourage people, and I'm a big believer in my own work, that when there is a third party doing the linkage, or even if you're doing your own linkage, really think through some good tabulations at different stages of the linkage process, maybe starting with the two data files separately, and then what happens if you link one item and don't link using one key and don't drop any records? What happens if you use two linkage variables, things like that, and whether it's just means and variances, row counts, missing data, things like that. Having that kind of trail of what the process was, nobody's going to tell you, oh, here are the names and here's how we match it, obviously. And it's generally too hard for the data provider, especially like an IT person or somebody who's not a researcher, to come up with interesting, relevant tabulations that would speak to your research concerns. But my experience is that if you ask for something, if you give somebody a table that's nicely specified or even some SAS code or whatever, it's not that hard for them during the linking process to generate those kinds of tabulations. And then you have a really nice record of what was done. You still don't have the actual linkages, but you would be able to, if you tried to replicate it, you would know if you were close or not. You'll certainly learn other things about that process. And so this isn't helpful for you ex post, but ex ante, I would really encourage folks to think about, specify those, could be fairly simple tabulations that you can do, that you can request along the way of the linkage process to better document and understand what happened as the individual data sets were getting transformed into your linked data file that you ultimately got your hands on. In terms of ex post, if he hasn't retired yet, would it be possible to try to get some of those tabulations on the linked data now? I don't know if you think that there's some kind of source material still, but even sort of what are the characteristics of the the unemployment insurance data that didn't get linked with the SNAP data, and what are the characteristics of the intersection of the SNAP data with the UI data, or whatever it is you're doing? Are there some ways to at least get row counts, mean values, maximum, and whatever it is at the different components that would at least document the process for you a little better and support some attempts to replicate in the future if you wanted, or at least some understanding of what it went into it. Does any of that seem relevant to what you're talking about?
Yes, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Anyone else have a war story to share, or a question about how to plan for the process, or circumvent some of the steps?
I have a question. I'm new to the process. So in one of the sessions, you talked about how sometimes we would submit algorithms to the folks who were hosting the data. And I was just wondering what that looked like, and if you could talk more about that piece of it a little bit more.
Yeah, I have both as a data user and as a data provider had multiple experiences where you can really provide SAS code or R code or whatever it is to say, this is how I want you to do this task for me. Like, you're going to link these data for me, but I am interested in linking the households in the January data because that's the most complete. And then I'd like you to link the member records every month. And so you can write it out, but sometimes it's just easier to give them code in addition to a nice explanation, so that they can do it exactly the way you want it. They're happier because they don't have to translate what you're talking about. And again, as I was just saying to Kevin, I would kind of think about some tabulations that would be proof that they did it the way that I wanted. So if I want all of the household members linked in the January data, then I might request a frequency of what month the household member data came from, and it should only say January on it. So that's the kind of algorithm. So it could be a linking rule. Take the social security number first. If not, then do this. Often people will come to us with, let's say they had some other data. On the ECLSK, the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study data, they ran some models where they have much richer child outcome and provider quality data. They ran a model, and now they're going to take those coefficients and give them to us. We have more data than, we have some restricted use data. We can use that model to generate some kind of predicted quality measure for them, which we then put out. They give us the code to run it, and the variables. We would ask them, like, here's the code book, put in the variable names you want, tell us how many cases you're expecting, and then we'll run it. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I just, again, it's new to me entirely, so I wasn't sure what you meant when you said algorithms, but providing code makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so sometimes the linkage rules get more like algorithms where there might be more of a complex flowchart, or as I said, it could be, if it's more of the fuzzy matching where you're assigning, modeling some kind of probability, and you want, sometimes the tool you really wish they were using is some open source package, and what they are actually using is Excel. And so you work hard to try to replicate whatever logic that the software that you wanted to use implements, and give it to them. They're almost never going to, the data provider is never going to do it for you, and even if they did, they wouldn't be as careful as you would. So it's generally better. I've never had anyone really refuse. If you're going to do their work for them, they never refuse. And as a data provider, if you're going to do my work for me, I'm never going to refuse.
Yeah, thank you.
Go on, unless there, oh, was there another question?
Nope, just saying thanks.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments about project planning? So just please, if you have a big deadline coming up, if you think you're graduating in 6 months, do not start your restricted use data project, 4 months in advance. It's just, it's really hard, and we will be upfront with people who tell us they want to defend in 4 months, but we're happy to give them data access, but it's highly unlikely that they are going to get through the process in 4 months, even if the data are not super. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how linkage choices can affect the inferential population. And as I mentioned, I think this is actually a topic that we've talked about throughout the session, but it's so important and kind of lurks. And so I wanted to make sure that people were really cognizant of it as they were, as you're moving out to do your own research. And so let's think about the time period of linkage. So I've talked before about workforce registry data. These would be data maybe held by a nonprofit at the state level that have information about each early childhood worker in the state and their demographic characteristics, their professional qualifications, the facility where they work, those kinds of things. Now imagine a research approach where you link every center in your data to all of the workers who have worked at that center over the course of a calendar year. And then imagine instead, again, the same list of centers, but only linking the workers that worked at that center in a given week. So everything else is the same, but in one case, you are matching each center to every worker who worked there over the course of the year. In the other case, you're only matching to workers who work there in a given week. So when you think about those two data files, the all-year worker data file and the one-week worker data file, what kinds of differences occur to you between those two data files? And we'll just go through these open.
So I could imagine situations in the full year one where you actually might get cross matches. I feel like there's a lot of transition in ECE workers, and so they've moved from one center to the other over a course of the year, and then trying to sort that out and how one would deal with that. And I wouldn't expect that in the single week linkage.
Yeah, that's a great example. And so now you really have to think about what happens if you have duplicates. Is that appropriate for your analysis? Does that need to be disentangled somehow? Great, that's a good issue to deal with. What else might you expect to differ between these? Which file do we think might have more rows in it? Where a row would be a center worker. So if every worker worked for a full year, then the number of workers at a center over the course of a calendar year would be the same as the number of workers at the center in a given week. But one of the issues we really talk a lot about in the early childhood space is churn in the workforce, particularly perhaps among lower skilled, lower paid staff. So maybe the teacher who has a BA and is committed to early childhood has been there for 12 years, but maybe the aide in the infant and toddler room, maybe that role turns over every 2 months with a different person. And so in the single week case, you would have maybe a teacher and an aide for a given center. In the case of a full year, maybe you would still have that one teacher, but perhaps this time you pick up 6 aides who each served that role sequentially for 2 months over the course of the calendar year. So if you think about, for example, talking about average characteristics, percent of the workforce that has a BA, if the teachers have BAs and the aides don't, then in the single week case, 50% of your workers had a BA. And in the 1 year case, 1/7, 14% of your workers had a BA. So neither of these is right or wrong. Right? Both of them are perfectly legitimate linking strategies. But the composition of the population that you identify can be quite different between the two. Does that make sense, people? The same thing comes up with childcare subsidy spells. If you sample at a point in time, you will have an overrepresentation of long spells relative to if you sample a longer span of time, the proportion of your spells that turn out to be short spells will increase because of churn. So this is something that you want to be cognizant of whenever you're choosing a linkage mechanism. Questions or comments about that? So then another issue comes to do with what your unit of linkage will be. I know that Carolina spent a good bit of time talking about the fact that you may have a choice of unit of linkage. Your unit of linkage doesn't have to be your unit of analysis. But just in terms of thinking about your inferential population, let's think about a case where we're interested in studying worker qualifications and the relationship of those qualifications to kindergarten readiness of their students. And so you could link each 4-year-old to their preschool teacher, one-to-one linkage. I guess many-to-one linkage. Teacher presumably has more than one student. And then you could conduct a student-level analysis of the relationship between the teacher's characteristics and the student's kindergarten readiness measure. You would alternatively do that at a classroom level or a center level, maybe at a census tract level. So how do you think about the trade-off between the most specific linkage possible, which would be the student to his or her own teacher, versus one of these higher levels where you're kind of aggregating a few observations into a measure and then linking? What are some of the pros and cons of each? I think Bianca's announcement that we were all being recorded, even when the slides are showing, got everyone to turn off their videos, and now I can't look at people and see what you're thinking, or at least guess what you're thinking.
So for this question, so we're only talking about linking at one point of time, right?
Correct, it'd be contemporaneous.
Okay, so I'm thinking in the first case, when we're linking each child to their teachers, we may encounter more missing data, even if it's more accurate. Whereas in the second case, at the classroom level, maybe we'll have fewer missingness, but the estimates may not be as precise.
And that pretty much in a nutshell is the idea that I wanted to convey. So thank you very much. That's exactly the point that I was trying to make, that there is frequently a tension where the more precisely you try to match, for example, students to their own teachers, the match, when you have it, is exactly relevant. You know that it's about exactly what you're talking about, but you tend to encounter more missing data issues. And so aggregating often will allow you to retain more of your sample and have better coverage properties. But the more precise linkage gives you more specific, cleaner measures with perhaps some more bias. And so talk about why would you expect more missing data for the student-teacher linkage?
Because I'm thinking about because there are multiple children and one teacher, and then when I know it's only one point in time, so we don't have to deal with issues of teacher turnover or facing the issue of successive teachers in a year or two. But still, when we're trying to look at the student assessment scores, maybe every child, won't have all the testing scores somehow.
Right. Somebody's sick one day and doesn't get assessed. There's a teacher who's a substitute for a month and so doesn't have all of the data in your data file like the regular teacher. Maybe the child is moving from one classroom to another and you don't know where to assign the child. There are all sorts of different issues. So that's very helpful. Thank you. And so as a rule, you will be trading off a more precise linkage that might bring with it more bias and undercoverage with a less precise linkage at a higher level of aggregation that has better coverage properties and less bias. That will be, yes.
Quick question on that. So I'm just not following. If you aggregate, say, average child outcomes at a center or a classroom level, that still takes into account the same missing data. I mean, if the data is missing, that is also being, that limits what you have to aggregate with, I suppose. Is that, I guess missing data at the one-to-one level is the same missing data at any level of aggregation. Is that not correct? Or
yeah, no, I see your point, and you're right. And but I think the point might be, for example, let's say there are 5 components to the assessment, and you have 3 of them for every child. You might be more comfortable aggregating what you have across the different components to create a classroom average than you would be using 3 of 5 components for a child as an individual. Or what if you're missing covariates or the linkage variable? You might be able to place them in the classroom, but not necessarily the date in which they entered the classroom. So you're right that there will
I
be, if you have missing data, or maybe you're more comfortable imputing a value if it's going to feed an aggregate estimate, then you would be just treating that data on its own.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Other comments or questions? Another issue with linkages can be that the complex stratified survey samples, which is generally what you would be using unless you're using your own homegrown surveys, have built into them a sampling design hierarchy that indicates for what subsets of the population it generates representative data. So for example, for the NSCC, we do generate state representative estimates for all 50 states and DC. Sometimes the sample sizes are small, but state is a stratum in our sampling design. So it is perfectly legitimate to use state level variables. Another project I work on, the National Longitudinal Surveys of Youth, is a nationally representative sample, but state is not the next layer. There is no state level within the sampling design. So in that case, it's really clusters of counties that are the second level sampling unit. If you took a state, let's say Ohio, there might be plenty of sample in Ohio, and you could link that sample to unemployment records or SNAP records or whatever you wanted. But the Ohio sample, people in the NLSY who happen to live in Ohio are not a statistically representative sample of people who live in Ohio. That's not how that survey sample was built. And so it's often the case that when we do these kinds of linkages, we are deviating from the survey design, and your estimates may still be interesting, but they may no longer be representative of a particular population. And that can be true for, if there's an oversample of an ethnic group or of a poverty category, it's sort of easiest to imagine with geography, but the question is the same. Are you, in the linkage, are you subsetting your data in a way that makes it lose its representativeness property? Again, might not be a reason not to do it, but you need to be cognizant.
Sorry, I have a quick question. So in this case, can you mitigate this issue with like a sampling weight to address the?
No, a sampling weight will not guarantee that the sampling weight will bring it back to the nationally representative proportions, but it will not make your sample representative of Ohio when it wasn't selected that way.
Okay, so I guess in designing the survey or collecting the data, there's no sampling weights like calibrated just to represent the state level.
If that's the design of the study, right? Different studies have different geographical hierarchies or other subpopulations that they are designed to represent.
Okay.
And if the survey you're using is not designed to represent some subpopulation that you're subsetting, there's nothing ex post you can do. I mean, you could try to make some model-based weights, maybe you'd get lucky, but there's really no sampling justification for trying to retroactively fit sample to represent a population it wasn't designed to represent.
Rupa, this is Bethany. I have a quick question about the weights while we're the subject. So with the NSCCE, if we're linking to admin data that potentially may not be representative, let's just say at the national level, what are the issues with using the weights in the NSCCE that we should be aware of?
So I would say that in the specific case of the NSCCE, you would always want to use the sampling weight. The sampling weight, what it does is adjust the relative proportions of the different cases that you're working with so that they have the right weight, right? So that some cases were vastly oversampled. They don't represent nearly as many other entities as other cases do. And so the sampling weights are very important if you're trying to describe a population to make sure that you are representing individuals in their relative proportion. Now, what that does is represent, whether it's workers that will give you a count of, say, workers in the US with this or that property. The question is, by the time you've completed your list of this or that property that you've subsetted to, do you know that you have a representative sample? So you still want the sampling weights so that within your analytic sample, cases are contributing in appropriate proportions to one another. But that does not guarantee you that the sum of your collect cases that you're using fully and accurately represent the population that you're trying to make an inference about. And maybe if you gave a specific example, Bethany, we could make it a little bit more concrete.
Yeah, I didn't really have a specific question. I was just asking if there was a question that I didn't know to ask, basically, if there were any issues with the weighting in the NSCCE that would be present with linkage that wouldn't be present when you're just working with the survey data.
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think you still want to use the sampling weight, and you still are not guaranteed that you're representing the entire population depending on what your analytic sample ended up being once you linked the two data files. But that's something I'll think more about as well. I'm hesitating only because, like, for example, think about that this workforce registry example under the time period. Now, you don't really have that in the NSCC because we only have a point in time. Our workforce sample is more like all workers in a single week. It's not, there's no real opportunity to have a year's worth of workers in the NSCC data. But sometimes in these linkages, depending on what unit you use, what aggregation you use, you could kind of elongate or transform your file in a way where maybe you would want to think, I think you still want to use the sampling weight, but the issue of the complexity of what the sum of the weights means may get more complicated, right? So in this case, if you took all the centers in the NSCC and you linked them to workforce registry data, so not the survey data, but workforce registry data, you still would want to use the center weight, sampling weight, but now you would have 10 workers for some centers and 3 workers for another center. And if you started doing a worker level analysis rather than a center level analysis, then I would have to consult my statistics colleagues to think about what would happen. So I think the main point I would say, Bethany, is that generally you always want to use a sampling weight, but my point with these slides is that linkage choices can affect the inferential population, and as you transform to different units and different time periods and things like that, you really want to be careful about how you define the population and how things like relative composition may be shifted.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would also be interested in this topic because I kind of like the example of the workforce and the centers. So if I study variables from the workforce and from the centers and link the data together, then the workers would have their own weights, and then centers would have their own weights. And for example, the software I'm working with has kind of like replicates all the functions for the survey situation, so that it can properly incorporate the weights, right? When I compute totals or means, or it sort of, there are like special functions for that, so that I cannot use like the normal functions, but it doesn't have like a merge function. And so I'm just kind of wondering, like,
What
how
kind
do
of
you?
software are you using?
Oh, so I'm using this R package called Survey, and it has like functions like SVI total, SVI mean, and so it kind of like provides all the, or like some of the functions that are sort of available in the base package or other packages, but it doesn't have like a merge function, its own merge function. So I'm wondering how you would combine, yeah, basically like 2 sets of weights into one, or how would you go about it? And you don't have to answer right now, but if you have any references for like articles or some resources that like cover this, and if you could like put it on a website, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. My head is spinning. So just in terms of the NSCC data, basically, if you are using the workforce data file, you should only be using the workforce weight. There is virtually no analytic context that I can think of in which you should be using workforce survey variable and the center weight. The example that we were just talking about, only the center data were coming from the NSCC, and the workers were coming from this registry data. So that was a little different. But if you are using workforce survey data in the NSCC, you would want to be using the workforce survey weight, which actually has as a component the center weight of the centers from which it came.
Oh, okay.
So they shouldn't really be combined. It's not like, for example, in the American Community Survey data or in the current population survey, there's like a household weight, and then there's like a member weight, and you combine them if you need to. That's not the way that NSCC workforce survey data work. The workforce weight is all, we've already done all that combining for you. And it is the standalone appropriate weight whenever you're using the workforce survey data.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you.
And Katie, you'll write down the name of that R package that does everything for you, and we'll investigate how to help users navigate it. Okay, thank you. Okay, another one, obviously, you know this, but the linked file is the intersection of the coverage of both of the data files. You know this, obviously, the administrative data cover one population, the household survey data, or whatever, your survey data cover another population, and it's the intersection of the two where your linked file resides. If your analytic purpose is really about, say, the administrative data program, then it's almost always the case that the linked file is really appropriate for what you want to do. But sometimes we link data from administrative programs because we're trying to get additional variables, but we're actually interested in some other topic. So let's say I link household survey data to unemployment insurance records because I want better measures of earnings than I have in the household survey. But my interest is not about unemployment insurance. My interest maybe is in how household income relates to childcare choices. Well, by linking to the unemployment insurance data and now focusing on a linked file, especially if I dropped the unlinked cases, I've now restricted, right, to parents who are working. There are no non-workers in my data. They're working in what we call covered employment, so something that actually feeds the unemployment insurance system, which probably does not include a lot of categories of self-employment, may not include many state university workers, may not include people who freelance or work under the table for cash or any of those kinds of things. If we're studying unemployment insurance, this is not an issue, but if I'm now going to just study childcare choice, I've removed kind of inadvertently the non-working parents, parents who are working in these other uncovered employment sectors. I need to be very conscious of that. And sometimes it just sort of, you inadvertently do it and you don't realize that that's the impact that's had on you. So particularly when you're using administrative data to link, but then your research question is not about that program or about that specific issue, it's more likely that you may have restricted your population in ways that you hadn't intentionally entered into. Comments or questions about that? So just some other ways that the linkage choice affects the sample. We talked about the unlinked records. Are you including them in your analysis? So we talked about when you link to childcare subsidies, you usually treat the unlinked records as if they do not receive household subsidy, childcare subsidies. So you keep them in your analysis and you treat them as not subsidized families. In other cases, you may just drop the unlinked record. What are the implications for your inferential population of doing that? We talked again yesterday about subgroups with poorer linkage rates, and we discussed that sometimes you keep them in and say, well, I probably have some bias in my linkage, and so my evidence might be weaker for this or that subgroup. Or sometimes we say, well, maybe you just respecify your analysis and say, I'm focused on English-speaking households only because you realize that your linkage rates were poor. So thinking about how were those linkage choices altering your population? Another one to keep in mind is what happens if there's a policy change in your administrative data during the period that you used it? So let's say early in the data period that you're using, families could qualify for SNAP at 150% of poverty. And then there was a regime change, and now it's only down to 125% of poverty. So there were families that had been eligible in the earlier period who are now no longer income eligible to receive food stamps. If what you're trying to do is study the effect of that policy change, then that's great. But if you are using your data file for some other analytic purpose, what have you done? What is your inferential population? It's people who were a certain income level before June and now are a certain level after June. You want to be really conscious and think about what does that mean for your analysis. And in some cases, maybe you could apply a 125 throughout the period and clean it up. And maybe in some cases you don't actually have that information, so you can't clean it up. So again, these are, I think my main point is you want to be aware, you want to think through what your inferential population is once you've done all of your linking machinations. Because it's very easy to inadvertently change your population when you hadn't thought about it. Comments or questions about that? Or about any of these or other ways that it seems like linkages could alter the population?
I'm interested in the second question in terms of the different mechanisms leading to poorer rates in different subpopulations. So I'm wondering if this is kind of similar to what we were talking about yesterday in terms of the Illinois household survey. So you mentioned the different approaches in addressing the missing data. For example, using the, in your example, you model the consent decision, but you also talked about the rates, looking at the rates of consent in different subpopulations. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about the shortcomings or the advantages of each approach in addressing the missing data issues.
Yeah, I guess I would say to the extent that you have a fairly good understanding, or you think you do, of what generates missing data, it makes sense to focus on those characteristics, and you have data on those features, it makes sense to focus on them individually. And for example, so let's use a concrete example. So test scores, okay? So I might say, well, there are the kids who are sick a lot and so just happen to miss test day and they're missing test scores. Then there are children who have IEPs or special needs who may have been exempted from the test, and I'm missing test scores for them. Then there are the children who moved into the school late or left before the testing period. They're in my data, but they don't have a test score, and I can remove them. And if I can actually pretty clearly nail, 80% of my missing data, I have a fairly good understanding of why I think I'm missing them, then using a more categorical approach can make sense, because for each of those, you may have more of an understanding or an assumption of, is that missing at random? Would I feel safe imputing values for this group, or do I have a proxy for it? Do I think using the prior test score is acceptable? Those kinds of things. In many cases, we don't know exactly the mechanism. So when I talked about consent yesterday, there were sort of two main categories. There are people who refuse, and then there were people where we didn't even ask them for consent because they did not have the legal authority to provide that consent. So that group is pretty clear. I can identify them, and I know they weren't even asked. The other group, they refused. I don't know, were they in a bad mood? Are they, liars and cheaters? Are they hiding something? Who knows? And so in that case, kind of a multivariate approach that models the consent might make more sense because I don't have really a theoretical basis on which to identify specific subgroups and trace out a mechanism. Also, we want to think about, well, how would I use this in kind of my sensitivity analyses and other analytic activities? And when I don't really know what's generating the missingness, then the only thing I can do is be concerned with its impact on my analyses. So then I'm interested in what can I measure and how are those variables linked to the outcomes that I'm interested in studying. Whereas if I have concrete ideas about the mechanisms, then I can more strategically conduct some sensitivity analyses, trace out processes, see what happens if I just fill in the data for this category using a multiple imputation process or something like that. Does that make sense and give you some
Yes.
ideas?
Yes, thank you.
Do other people have other thoughts about how they would think about that question? When would you want to model consent? When would you look at consent rates by different subgroups? Okay, so we've talked a lot about these likely trade-offs. One of the biggest ones is sample size versus precision. The more inclusive our criteria are, the more cases we'll get, but we might be moving a little further from the particular analytic question we had, and that'll depend on what you want to know and what the acceptable trade-offs are. Linkage unit. Here, there's both the sample size versus precision, which we just talked about, but there's also the real life issue that there might be some analytic gain from a more precise linkage, but there may also be a lot more legal red tape, cost, time delay for going to that next level, right? So linking school level, grade level test scores, those are on the web. But if I want to link student level test scores, I might have to go get a wet signature from the parent and then get permission to get the individual level test scores. What's worth it? And how do I know without trying it, right? My advice as a data provider is always to researchers who come to us, if you're not sure, try the easy thing first. Link at the county level or link at using the publicly available school data and see if there's even anything there. If there are relationships there that seem worth pursuing, then you can go for the deeper data. But why would you spend 18 months trying to get access to data only to then find out that it didn't really give you the kinds of relationships you were hoping for? So we frequently, when people come to use the NSCC data, we say to them, have you used the public use data to see if this is even going to go anywhere? Like, we're happy to give you these data. You know, we want more people to use the data, but I hate to have someone go through all of that setup and process and delay only to realize that they could have learned what they learned using public use data in a weekend. In terms of analysis unit, I think Carolina talked about the fact that the optimal level of analysis might differ. Maybe your administrative data are stronger at the household level. Maybe your household survey data are stronger at the child level. And that's a trade-off that you'll have to make based on what's your research question. Bias versus coverage, we talked about. And then the ability to conduct sensitivity analyses or assess linkage quality. I was talking about this just now. There are some data strategies, either depending on how you're undertaking the linking or what variables you'll have available, where there are more opportunities to conduct some sensitivity analyses or assess linkage quality. And in some cases, it's more of a black box and you really can't figure out ways to test how much different choices have mattered. I think obviously some of the more sophisticated solutions are a little bit more black box, but there can be great value in having those supports and that extra data along the way to be able to conduct some of these sensitivity analyses. So when you're choosing between two research strategies, it's worth at least considering the potential value of having some additional variables. Maybe the data file that you're thinking about has some aggregate totals. Maybe you're more interested in city, but there are actually really rich county aggregates. maybe you should do your work at the county level first, just so you can match to the available data and understand how, the properties of your linked file. And then if you want to go to the city level, you could. But these kinds of issues about what a particular analytics strategy will allow you to do in terms of testing different approaches and linkage strategies, that's definitely something I would take into consideration as I was choosing one strategy or not. Are there other trade-offs that people would suggest that you're either grappling with your own project, and you're not sure, should I do this at the classroom level, should I do it at the center level, or that have occurred to you in the course of our discussion? Okay, well, let's try an example here. Let's say I'm interested, I'm obsessed with EC and test scores today, apparently. So I'm interested in knowing whether high quality EC receipt at age 4 is associated with third grade reading scores. It just so happens where I live, not in the hypothetical world, but in the real one, my community is actually undertaking a census of 4-year-olds in our community. So we're surveying the households that contain 4-year-olds to understand a range of health, socioeconomic issues, developmental delays, lots of different things, including their early childhood non-parental care experiences. And then one of the ideas is that when these 4-year-olds become third graders, we would have reading test scores for them because there's only one school district in our town. And so we would have all of this rich data about 4-year-olds, and in 4 short years, many of them will become third graders. And we could look at the relationship of the quality of their non-parental care at age 4 in the context of their third grade reading scores. So what kind of linkage challenges come to your mind as you think about this?
So I can imagine issues around the linking identifier. So there's a bunch of skittishness around social security number, names change, addresses change. So I would expect imperfect matching longitudinally on those things. I would also anticipate a lot of consent issues, especially with the test score data. We work in a state where people are super wary of the state / government / anybody other than themselves, and don't like to consent to much at all. So that would be, despite your lovely community scenario, a still serious source of missing data, potentially.
Okay, those are all good points. So we had names changing, addresses changing, skittishness about providing identifiers like social security numbers, and then wariness to provide consent to link the third grade test scores. I think those are the main. Okay, what other issues you first, as if that laundry list were not enough to depress.
Well, so this one also I think is particularly interesting because it's a high quality ECE, but your source of the ECE information is the parent survey. So I don't know if this is a linkage issue so much as a general data issue, but ultimately you're characterizing a specific center that many parents will have reported on. I sort of assumed it was a household survey that didn't include the providers as sort of an authoritative source on how things were happening. So it's up to the parent report, and those might differ across the many different parents involved in any particular center. And so you'll have to deal with what you do when parent A says one thing on the question that you're using for a quality indicator and parent B says something very different about the same program.
That's a good point. And so I agree with you that quality is an issue. That in this particular case, they're actually asking, we live in a fairly small community, they're actually asking the name of the provider. And they're hoping that the quality rating improvement system data will provide the quality indicator. So for every 4-year-old, they know the name of the preschool, and they will consult the rating data to determine which of them are high quality or not.
Got it. So then a third linkage there, or I guess, but yeah, another linkage of another data set.
Exactly. In addition to, right, so there are the linkage issues there of, do all parents actually describe, you would think a provider name would be fairly consistent, but we actually collected provider names in the NSCC, and it's amazing how many different ways people report the name of their child's preschool. And then also there could be, as you say, missing data in the quality ratings. That those missing data could themselves have bias. In our community, at least, it's a lot of the high-end Montessoris that don't participate in the quality rating system, whether they're high quality or not, I guess, an issue. But they are certainly the more expensive ones that have generally the more educated parents.
Yeah.
What else?
Formal care providers who aren't in a QRIS because they don't think of themselves as a formal ECE environment per se.
Precisely, exactly. That's all good. What else comes to mind about this strategy?
So there are two things that I can think of first because it involves the time component. So we may expect children moving in and out of school district. So that's the student mobility issues. And secondly, I'm thinking about the sample selection bias because in the literature, it's been documented that immigrant population has less access to the high quality ECE services. So maybe they're less likely to have data on those subpopulation. So it concerns about the missing data mechanism we're talking about.
Those are two excellent points. And I wonder the extent to which they'll find that, as you say, a lot of the quote unquote non-high quality ECE is just not documented. People didn't provide provider names. There is no quality rating for them. And so you might have a lot of high quality ECE and not enough other quality ECE to do this analysis ultimately, or that you can tell that it's not high quality. So we're actually only in the pilot phase here. What might be done, do you think, in the execution of this community survey so that the research design can be salvaged despite all of these excellent points that everyone brought up? issues? We talked about mobility, names changing. Somebody this morning mentioned grade retention and double promotion, so the kids might not hit third grade at the same time. We talked about parents not consenting for third grade. What are some strategies we could tackle?
So from the linkage to the QRIS system standpoint, you, instead of asking an open-ended question on where do you go for ACE services, you could provide a list that included the option to write in if they weren't on there, but that would provide them an initial more solid match.
Okay. That sounds like a good strategy.
In terms of student mobility, I think we can try to collect information or data at multiple times if possible. So yeah, we can update the information trying to capture the students that moved out of the school district versus who stayed.
So you're thinking about in kindergarten or first grade, those years in between
Right.
the 4-year-old and the third grade. Yeah, I think that's a great, that's my only hope, but you guys may have other good ideas. Another topic that we've talked about as a community is that there are, although most kids go to the public schools, there are Catholic schools, there are other independent schools in the community, and some of the third graders might end up in those places. And are there ways to either administer tests in those settings, if they're already administering them, get those schools to share the data? That's another piece. All right, well, we are at the end of our time. We have really enjoyed our conversations with you. My whole team is not here today, but we have really enjoyed hearing about your work and thinking about the very good questions that you raised. As Amber and Bianca have been telling you all along, we're very interested in hearing how did this work for you? What do you wish you had learned more about? What do you think about the format? All of those kinds of things. We are always available. The NSCCE team is always available to answer your questions about our data. You can check our websites or email nscce@norc.org. If any of you has a proposal that you wanted us to react to or comment on, we would be happy to do that. And in general, we very much look forward to reading the linkage-related research that you will be publishing in the coming year. So thank you very much for participating in our work.
Thank you, everyone, for your participation in session 6. Thank you, Rupa. Thank you to all of the instructors for giving such a comprehensive overview of linking administrative data with survey data in the NSCCE data. Like Rupa said, we would love for you to take our survey in the announcement section of Canvas. There is a link already up. It says final evaluation. The first part will be specifically related to session 6, and the second part will be just an overall survey for the entire workshop. Those of you who have attended all of the sessions will receive a certificate of completion after we conclude, and thank you so much for participating in our virtual data training.